Welcome to the Climate Adaptation Research Symposium. My name is J.R. DeShazo, and I am the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. And it's my great honor to welcome you, over 2,000 registrants, to this first of its kind event. This symposium couldn't have come at a more critical time. As I look out over the skies of Los Angeles filled with smoke and ash, with record-breaking fires happening up and down the west coast of the United States. Only 3 weeks ago, we broke all kinds of heat wave records with triple-digit temperatures. And think about the rest of the country and the world experiencing increasingly intense storms, flooding, wildfires, heat waves, where the low-income and vulnerable populations bear these impacts the most. The three objectives of this symposium, I think, couldn't become more relevant than they are today. Our first objective is to continue to identify the impacts of climate change. Who is impacted and how much? Our second goal is to begin to identify resiliency policies and interventions that can lessen the impacts of climate on our communities and evaluate which strategies are not only most efficient and effective, but equitable as well. And our third objective today is to create better connections among you all so that we have a more robust and prepared and capable team of researchers as we move forward to continue to identify impacts and address solutions and craft effective policies. I'd like to thank the symposium's supporters and sponsors, Southern California Edison and Burrell Happold. I'd also like to thank the California Strategic Growth Council for their support. I'd like to recognize the contributions of our organizing committee who selected the 40 papers that will be presented today out of over 150 that were submitted. I very much want to extend my gratitude to the Luskin Center staff, in particular calling out Michelle Einstein and Christian Zarate, who transformed this from an in-person event to a virtual event, a very Herculean task. Thank you guys very much. We hope in the future to make this a recurrent event and to host you here in Los Angeles and be able to dine and socialize, as well as hear great research findings and have intellectual discussion in the future. And so please, as we move forward, let's stay in touch. And if you're like me and having a hard time figuring out which of the 17 sessions to attend today, don't worry, we're going to record those. We're going to share those with you after the event. I hope you enjoy today's symposium. And with that, it's my honor to turn you over to your session moderators.
Okay, thank you for tuning into this session, understanding understanding the impacts of climate-related disasters. Again, we are very grateful for our collaborators who made this day possible. Some housekeeping items to cover in case you haven't used this webinar platform before, which I think most of us is the case. You can move and resize the widget windows within the console. If you have any questions for the presenters, and there will be a question and answer period at the end of each presentation, you can ask them using the Q&A widget. So, I'm David Eisenman, Professor of Medicine and Public Health at UCLA. We have an amazing group of presentations today. Climate adaptation requires addressing a world of increasingly frequent and severe disasters. These presentations ask important questions, sometimes with surprising results. Each of our presentations will be between 16 and 18 minutes, followed by a brief comment by our discussant, Paul Kovacs, followed by question and answer from the audience. Paul Paul Kovacs, we are honored to have him here, is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at Western University in Canada. So our first presenter is Judson Boomhower, assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of San Diego and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. I'm now going to turn it over to Judson.
All right, thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here. Let me say at the top that this work I'm going to show you today is co-authored with Patrick Bayless at the University of British Columbia. And this is a paper about wildfires. So obviously, this is a topic that's been on all of our minds for the past few weeks. We're very aware that people throughout the West have faced danger or lost homes and belongings or struggled with poor air quality. So certainly this is a timely topic today. Scientists will tell us that our problems with fire in California and elsewhere are due to a combination of climate change and other factors. And the changing climate compounds existing challenges and increases the urgency to respond and adapt. One of the underlying causes of the wildfire problem is a large amount of construction that has taken place in high fire hazard areas during the past several decades. So let me just show you a couple of photos. This is a photo of Colorado Springs. This is a photo in California near the Thomas Fire. This is a photo outside of Denver. This photo is from Idaho. So as we think about how to adapt in the face of this problem that seems like it's just going to continue to get worse, it's important to understand why the status quo has been this really rapid rate of growth in fire hazard areas. The different potential answers to that question imply different public policy responses for adaptation. So some candidate answers to that question, and these are certainly not mutually exclusive. One possibility is that the natural amenities and the other attractive features of living in what's called the wildland-urban interface simply justify the risk for many residents, and that this is a trade-off that people are willing to make. Another possibility is that that residents in fire hazard areas systematically underestimate the risk associated with wildfires. A third story that you hear, particularly in California, is that perhaps restrictions on adding housing in high-priced cities push development out into the hinterlands where fire risk is high. And finally, a fourth potential cause is incentive issues caused by policies for land use planning and fire protection. There's evidence and reasoned speculation to support probably all four of these explanations as important drivers of development in fire hazard areas. What we're going to focus on in this paper is one of them. We're going to think about this fourth issue of incentives in land use planning and fire protection to understand its potential contribution to this issue. And in particular, we're going to think about the way that fire protection is financed in high wildfire risk areas. So a major share of the financial burden of fighting wildfires in the United States falls onto the federal government and to a lesser degree on state governments. This is because of historical institutional reasons and because of the huge areas of federal land ownership in the Western United States. This chart is showing you how direct federal expenditures on wildland firefighting have grown since 1985. Federal agencies now spend $2 to $3 billion per year fighting wildfires. This doesn't include additional state expenditures that altogether would add another several billion dollars to this figure, noting that some of those state and local expenditures are reimbursed from the federal government through FEMA grant programs. So the takeaway from this time series is that there's an enormous amount of money spent fighting wildfires every year, and that those expenditures are rapidly increasing. On the other hand, decisions about new housing development are generally made at the local level. So at the risk of putting too fine a point on it, I'll say this leads to a situation where localities and individuals choose where and how to build, while the federal and state governments bear much of the cost of fighting fires. So the focus of our paper is to understand the economic implications of these split incentives. One clear implication here is that there's going to be a distributional effect. These large federal and state expenditures on firefighting represent transfers to homeowners in high fire cost areas. And we also might think that there are efficiency effects, that the decisions that local governments and homeowners make are actually affected and distorted by this split incentive issue. So one margin where we might think decisions are affected is the margin of siting and zoning. We know that there are real financial benefits to local governments from approving new development for property tax reasons and other reasons. So we might think that this situation results in more WUI, wildland-urban interface development, than would otherwise happen. There are a couple other margins that are also potentially interesting here. We might think that there are effects on lot size and development density, because one of the things we show in the paper is that how homes are arranged on the landscape has an important connection to the cost of protecting homes from fire. And we also might think about how these incentives play all the way through to individual homeowner decisions about construction and maintenance and vegetation management. Of course, Patrick and I are not the first researchers to look at this institutional setting and think that there may be some interesting incentive issues here. Policymakers and fire managers and researchers have talked about this issue of moral hazard for quite some time. What's been missing is really a clear understanding of exactly how big this implicit subsidy to fire zone development is. And so that's what Patrick and I that's what we do in our paper. So we provide the first quantitative estimates of the implicit subsidy due to fire protection in great spatial detail for the entire West. So to be very clear about our objective, we are going to calculate the expected cost to the federal and state governments to protect a given home in a given location from wildfire over its lifetime. In order to do that, we've put together a large database of historical firefighting expenditures that I'll tell you about in a minute. As a first step, we examine how the amount of money spent to extinguish a fire increases when homes are located in harm's way. That allows us to understand how much more money is spent on a given incident relative to an otherwise comparable fire that doesn't threaten homes. And we'll take that difference as the component of firefighting spending that we'll think of as being spent directly for the benefit of homeowners. And then we'll add up all of this historical spending that we measure as spending to protect homes. So we'll think about the historical cost of protecting every home in the West, and then we'll average those historical protection costs together across groups of similar risk homes in an actuarial exercise that will tell us the expected future cost of protecting a given new home that's built today. So that's the roadmap for the exercise. I'll just take a minute here to say, obviously, this is an ambitious and complicated empirical exercise that depends on various methodological details and assumptions that I'm not going to have time to cover in this short talk, but everything is in the paper for folks who are interested in knowing the details. So let me just briefly show you the data. We've put together this data set of incident level expenditures from the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So we assembled this through a combination of many emails and phone calls and Freedom of Information Act requests and Public Record Act requests to the individual agencies. And then we spent a lot of time cleaning and harmonizing the data to put together a cohesive and useful and correct database. And we have, depending on the agency, between 5 and 20 years of historical incident level expenditures. And then the other important data set in this paper is going to be real estate data that tells us the location, value, and year built for the universe of 17 million single family homes in the 11 Western states that you can see in this map here. So let me go quickly through some of the key results. The first thing that comes out of the data, once we've merged everything together and cleaned things up and implemented our empirical exercise, is that the presence of homes increases firefighting expenditures dramatically. This figure is showing you that a wildfire that starts more than 40 kilometers from the nearest home costs about 90% less to put out than a fire that starts fewer than 10 kilometers from private homes. These estimates are holding constant fuel type, weather, and other factors that affect incident costs, and isolating the component of expenditure spending that seems to be driven purely by perceived threat to homes. A second result is that once you get past a relatively low threshold of development, firefighting costs don't seem to increase much as you add more homes in the path of the fire. So one explanation for this result might be that the cost of some activities to quote unquote stop a fire, like constructing fire line and sending air tankers, are fixed in the sense that they don't vary depending on how many homes are on the protected side of the line. But this figure is showing you that the average cost of putting out a fire that threatens many thousands of homes is not much higher than the average expenditures to put out a fire that threatens 1,000 or even a few hundred homes. And this implies that there are big economies of density in fire protection in the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. This next slide describes how we get from our regression analysis of historical incidents to our ultimate objective of structure-specific expected protection costs. It's a little wonky, and I'm going to gloss over some things, but again, all the details are in the paper. So for every fire in the historical data, we measure the difference between the actual firefighting cost and what would have been spent if there were no homes near the ignition point. We take that measured home protection spending and use the real estate data to allocate it across homes threatened by the fire, putting more weight on homes closer to the ignition point. And then for every individual home in the data, we add up how much money we've assigned to that home as being spent to protect it from fire. We annualize that and calculate a net present value for those historical costs. And the final thing that we do, again, is we take these expectations over actuarial groups of homes, where we're lumping together homes with similar physical fire hazard on the landscape in similar regions of the country and in areas with similar development density. And these expected future protection costs are what we think of as the real object of interest in the paper. So I'm looking at the clock and I think I have a couple minutes left, but please interrupt me if I've gone on too long. I'll go quickly through this slide as well, but this is showing you how we calculate different cost metrics that vary in completeness and in strength of required assumptions. Our suppression-only metric just thinks about direct incident expenditures by federal agencies. Our suppression plus metric is what I will be mostly showing you today. That also accounts for prevention expenditures and the fixed costs of maintaining the readiness of the firefighting system. We have an additional metric for California that takes advantage of the particularly good data on state level expenditures that we have from CAL FIRE. So with a little bit of time I have left, let me show you how these per home protection costs vary depending on two margins: the underlying physical fire hazard due to vegetation, topography, and other factors, and the density of housing development in a given area. The grid that you're seeing on the slide crosses 20 bins of physical fire hazard with 20 bins of development density. And the colors indicate the average net present value of the lifetime protection costs for a single home. You can see that in the high hazard, low density areas in the upper left of the grid, the expected per home protection cost has a net present value of tens of thousands of dollars or more. These are areas with a high likelihood of difficult to suppress fires, where the high costs of firefighting aren't being spread over very many neighboring homes. And if you go down to the bottom right corner of that grid, you can see that costs are much lower in low fire hazard, high density areas. This table summarizes the distribution of expected protection costs numerically. We're thinking about 8 million homes in the Western US that are located near areas of wildland vegetation. On average, the protection costs are low. So the net present value of the suppression plus metric is $2,400 on average, which over the life of a home, I would not think about as that much. But the upper tail of these expected future protection costs is quite large. So the 95th percentile is about $8,000, and the 99th percentile is about $23,000. And if you think about those numbers as a share of the transaction value of the home, these are quite big. This is 6 and about 20% of the transaction value of the home, which I think is reasonable to imagine that these expenses would start to change incentives for development a little bit. So broadly, where are we thinking about this money going? Well, this map, this zoomed out map of the West is showing you average expected protection costs in grid cells throughout the Western United States. You may not be able to read the legend on the bottom, but that legend is top coded at $30,000 net present value. And you can see that the places with high expected protection costs are rural Northern California, Eastern Oregon and Washington, Western Montana, Idaho, all places that we think about a lot of firefighting activity. The one place that doesn't light up on this map, as much as you might think it would at first, is Southern California. And we think about that result as being driven by the fact that the huge amounts of money being spent on firefighting in Southern California are usually averaged across more dense housing developments in the WUI. The last results that I'll show you are what happened when we zoom in and think about things at a much more local level. So this is zooming in on Shasta County, California. The gray line going up the middle of the map is Interstate 5. And you can see the city of Redding there in the center of the map. So what jumps out of this local exercise is that near the towns where development density is relatively higher and vegetation is relatively more sparse, fire risk is lower, expected protection costs are low. And as you move out from the city, you have fewer neighbors and you have more vegetation, more difficult topography, higher fire risk, and these expected protection costs are rapidly climbing. This is San Diego County, where I live, and you can see there's the same story as you move out into eastern San Diego County. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can talk about how these issues might affect incentives and what we do about that in the paper in the Q&A. Let me just wrap up by saying we've estimated geographically differentiated implicit subsidies due to wildland firefighting for the entire Western United States. The implied transfers are large, with potentially important implications for distribution and efficiency. And our empirical analysis provides a roadmap for thinking about designing policies that would internalize some of these costs. Broadly, we think about these results as adding to the evidence that institutional and public policy factors are really important for determining the ultimate costs of the impacts of climate change. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Judson. That's fascinating. And I'm now going to hand it over to Paul Kovacs, who can give a comment. And then I ask the audience to provide their questions in the Q&A bar, and we will select some for our speaker.
Thanks, David. Judson, that was a really, really excellent paper, very thoughtful and very considered. A comment for you, Judson, and a comment broadly for the entire audience. Judson, one of the areas where I mentioned it might be useful for you and I to speak later is the possible role that insurance might play to be used as a mechanism to achieve some of the goals set out here. One of the views of how premium taxes were introduced at the state level, certainly those of us based in Canada, how they were introduced at the provincial level, was that 150 years ago, the fire agencies, the urban fire agencies, were run by insurance companies. And when it became appropriate to turn them over to become public government agencies, taxes were put on homeowners to pay for the cost of firefighting. And the way that it was done, at least initially was laid out, was through putting a tax on insurance, because insurance, these are the buildings that are being protected. So there has been some thought in one jurisdiction that's tried to get some of the rural firefighting costs recovered through an insurance type mechanism. Is an interesting thing we might explore. For everyone, over the last 25 years, the number of people living in the United States has increased by about 65 million people, or 25% in 25 years. There's been very rapid growth, and people with their new homes need to go somewhere. It's intriguing to contrast part of what Judson has shared with us in terms of how wildfire is being managed to compare to some other hazards like flood. Over the last 25 years and much longer, there's been a very aggressive effort to try to not allow new development to happen in areas known to be at high risk. That's being applied in flood, it's being applied to a number of hazards, but not being applied to wildfire. And the intriguing public policy question is why? And why are we failing to put in the policy and the incentives that are being applied for other hazards like flooding and failing to apply them for wildfire? One of the issues is people need somewhere to go. And it's my understanding about 15% of the wildland in Western United States and a growing share in Western Canada and other places is starting to be developed now. 85% is not yet developed. And the risk, if we fail to get this right on wildfire, is not only higher wildfire costs and more damage to buildings and people at risk and loss of life, but the loss of the wilderness. We lost the forests in the eastern United States and eastern North America. We lost the forest in much of Europe because 100 years ago, 200 years ago, we did not have a specific thought through approach to how we were going to develop and allow agricultural land and then urban development to occur. And the failure to apply development policies led to the loss of the forests in many parts of the world. And this pressure is now coming in the Western United States, also in Western Canada. So getting this right, borrowing from other areas like flood, where we have chosen as a public policy response to identify areas with high flood risk and either prohibit development or put in very clear regulations about what's to be done. There are some very specific actions that can be done in areas known to be at wildfire risk. California has a building code, none of the other states do. Building codes are one mechanism, but community development could be done much more effectively if you are going to allow development in the interface. There's a whole host of different policy opportunities, and what Judson has very creatively done here is start to quantify some of the key elements that are critical here. So my broad comment to everybody, this is a really important policy issue. We're actually only at the beginning. This is going to get much worse. Climate change has brought us together today because climate change is leading to more wildfires, but this is a much broader issue. We've got millions of people looking for a place to live. They're choosing to move into the interface because the incentives, are encouraging them. And there are policy responses that have been developed for other hazards and can be applied here for wildfire. And this conversation, informed by some of the work by Judson and others, can lead to a much better conversation. So David, thank you for the opportunity to share just some thoughts here, but I think the conversation here about Judson's paper, I think will be really important. Can I turn it back to you, David?
Yes, we have time for one question. Judson, the question comes in from Jetta Finson. What are the implications of this spending in terms of equity? does a higher amount end up being spent on more expensive houses? Judson, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so that's a great question. We came into this from the perspective of Southern Californians, and I think we're used to thinking about places like Malibu. There's a really great environmental history article called "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn," which is a pretty provocative piece that folks might be familiar with from many years ago. So there's this notion of lots of money being spent to protect really expensive homes in Southern California. And that certainly happens. But overall, what really jumps out of the data is that the really high protection cost places are rural, systematically rural places. And that means that systematically, on average, the people who really are getting a lot of the spending are actually lower income folks. Just because in the United States, it tends to be that wealthier folks live in the cities on average.
Okay, thank you, Judson. We're now going to turn to our second speaker. That was really fascinating. And I will say people can contact Judson for further questions. And please note that the speakers' bios are provided on the climate on the workshop site. I'm not going into long bios for each speaker. Our next speaker is Stephane Hallegatte, who is the lead economist of the World Bank Climate Change Group. Stephane, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to present here. And I think that the transition is pretty easy because Judson ended answering a question about equity, and this is exactly what I want to talk about. And I'll start by explaining a little bit what is the motivation of this work before I turn to the how we do it. And I apologize in advance if I have to go a little bit quickly on some of those aspects, but hopefully we'll have time during the questions if anything is unclear. So let me start with the fact that the World Bank has been investing quite a lot in the last 10 years in risk assessment, helping countries do risk assessments to make better decisions. And as probably everybody knows in this audience, traditional risk assessment, we look at the hazard, so the physical events that can occur in one place, like hurricanes, earthquakes. Then we look at the exposure, like the population and the assets being affected. And then we look at the vulnerability, especially on the assets. And we calculate asset losses or the risk to assets, so the average value of the repair or replacement that we expect. And this approach where we have a very big focus on the asset and the reconstruction value is what led to the newspaper articles that you see after each disaster. Here, Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria with $43 billion in losses, or Hurricane Irma in Antigua and Barbuda, 300 million in damages. And there are a few issues with these estimates. First, what exactly does that mean in terms of effect on people? 300 million on Antigua and Barbuda versus billions in Florida or elsewhere in the US. To communicate better about risk, we need to be able to describe better the real impact on people. And the second problem, which was the topic of the previous question, is that if you use this type of risk assessment to guide investments in disaster risk reduction, you end up investing mostly in cities, mostly in rich places, because that is where expensive assets are located. And as an institution focusing on the reduction of poverty, of course, it's a slight issue for us if the methodology we use tend to push all investments toward the richest places. So here, what I'll try to do is to explain how we try to complement the traditional risk assessment, starting from the asset loss estimated with very traditional methods, to add a fourth block, which we call socioeconomic resilience, which we define as the ability of the affected population to cope with the losses and to recover from the shock. And we do that by trying to assessing well-being losses using basic welfare theory and defining the socioeconomic resilience as basically the ratio of the loss in terms of assets per the impact on well-being. So the more resilient you are, the more you can experience asset losses without losing well-being or welfare. So if you want to do that, the first thing is that you have to look at the household. You have to look at the families, and you have to take into account what they have. So the assets that every household owns, but also where do they make an income from? Are they receiving remittances from abroad? Are they receiving social protection transfers and all of that? So you have to look at the asset of households, but also at all of the tools and instruments that households have to deal with shocks. And here I don't want to get too much into the details, but there are many ways people can manage shocks. You can diversify your revenue, you can use insurance, you can have savings, you can be protected by adaptive social protections. Different households use different tools. People use also different tools for small shocks and big shocks. So all of this space of instruments and tools that people use needs to be taken into account to do a full risk assessment, because losing your roof is very different if you're insured or not insured, or if you have savings or no savings. So our goal is really to take into account all of the socioeconomic contexts at the household level to be able to describe better the impact of disasters. So how do we do that? Here I won't be too long, but just to give you a sense of the approach, we start from household surveys. So in a country like the Philippines, we would have surveys with 40,000 households. And for each of these households, we have the demographics, we have a weight, how much the household represents in the population, and a lot of variables like income, exposure to various risks, which we can calculate. We can calculate asset vulnerability based on the type of buildings, but also all of the sources of incomes and so on. And so we can have the distribution of, here I show consumption in one region of the Philippines. And the question we'll be having is how this distribution of consumption will change when there is a shock. So first, we do everything at the household level. So it's micro simulations. And for each household, based on localization and their assets, we try to estimate the amount of asset loss that they will experience. But when we do that, we're not looking only at the assets people own. So if you're looking at the asset loss that will affect an household, of course, the first thing is if they lose their own asset, they will be affected. So they might have their house damaged. If they have goats, if you lose 3 goats in a drought, this is directly affecting you and your income. But you can also be affected because the factory located kilometers away is destroyed. And you don't own the factory, but that's where you work. So your income will be affected by impact on somebody else's assets. And of course, if the factory is fine, but the road to go from your home to the factory is destroyed, same thing. This is public assets, but you need those public assets to make an income. In that work, we're not looking at the assets that people own and how they are affected. We're looking at what we call the effective household capital, which is the assets that people use to make an income. And to get a bit into the details, we assess the effective capital based on people's income. But the important thing here is we cannot look only at the assets people own to estimate the impacts, because income shocks might occur even if there is no direct asset loss. So once we calculate those impacts on assets, we try to calculate impact on incomes. And here things are again complicated because the value of the asset lost or the value of rebuilding or reconstructing is not the value of the income being lost. This is an image of the Bay Bridge in the Bay Area damaged by the earthquake in '89. And of course, the repair costs to fix that bridge has no relationship with the impact of not having that bridge for months on the local economy. So the relationship between the repairs and the income shock is something which is really complicated. And in this work, and okay, I don't have time to go into those details, but basically, if you have a very simple production function linking your assets to your income, traditionally we have decreasing returns. So the more assets you accumulate, the least productive they will be. When you're losing assets, the impact on income will depend on which assets will be lost. And if you're not very careful at how you model that, you will underestimate quite a lot the impact of asset losses on income. And here we're making a very simple assumption, which is that if you lose 10% of your assets, you will be losing 10% of your income. So we don't have declining returns here to represent the fact that that the relationship between asset and income is not like in a long-term growth model. This is a shock over the short term. So once we have the shock on income, we have to do one more step, which is to look at the shock on consumption. And when we move from income to consumption, there are basically two things we have to take into account. One is the fact that if your households and you're losing, for instance, 3 of your goats in your farmer in Ethiopia, say, the impact on consumption will be two things. You have fewer goats, so your income, which is using those goats, will be decreased. And in addition, if you want to get back where you were, well, you need to rebuild your capital stock. You need to have those 3 goats again, and you need to buy them. And this is a reconstruction cost. So the impact on consumption is the sum of the income you're losing and the share of consumption that you have to redirect to rebuilding your asset stock. And of course, you can do that very quickly. In that case, you let your consumption drop, but you recover very quickly. Or you can do that very slowly, in which case you smooth the income shock, but the shock becomes much longer. And here we assume that households optimize that choice, looking at their residual income and the savings and social protection transfers or insurance transfer that they get. So when we do all that, we have this shift in the distribution function that I was talking about. So here in gray, you have the consumption distribution in the Cagayan Valley in the Philippines after a typhoon. And you see in pink how this distribution shifts when there is a typhoon hitting the area. And that makes it possible for us to talk, for instance, about the poverty impact. So in the Philippines, there is an official poverty line. You're counting households moving from above the line to below the line. And in that case, for instance, it's around 200,000 households who would fall in poverty in the region in case of a typhoon. And of course, it's a good metric because it's very simple to explain to economists and non-economists. It really talks about the impact on people. It's very easy to understand what it means to fall into poverty. So here we start creating new metrics to measure the impact of those disasters that can usefully complement the metrics using currency units and dollars and pesos. And of course, while the asset loss will be mostly measuring what happens to rich people, poverty impacts will be mostly measuring what happens to poor people. So one of the goals was to try to propose a metric looking at everybody, but with a sort of distributional weight so that we take into account the impact on poor people. And this is what we do by adding this last block in the analysis, which is to calculate the well-being losses. And nothing very sophisticated here. We're using a standard welfare function, but keep in mind what we're trying to do here. When we look at post-disaster situations using surveys, you can see very well that when somebody like me is affected by a disaster and I have to fix the roof, I have a lot of luxury consumption that I can skip so that I get the money to fix my roof. As soon as you're looking at poor people being affected, we see cuts in food intake, with strong impact on children especially. We see impact on healthcare, and we see impact on education with people taking kids out of school, and in a significant fraction, kids never come back. So what we're trying to measure here is this difference between being affected through luxury consumption versus being affected by reduction in basic needs. And we do that with an elasticity of the marginal utility of consumption. So basically valuing $1 in losses more for poor people than for rich people. But I think it's useful to keep in mind that what happens really is that your consumption basket is changed, and basic needs are affected for poor people. So we do it in a very simple way to represent all of the complexities of this change in consumption. All that I described here is done at the household level. Then what we can do is we can reaggregate at the regional or country level all of the asset losses. We can reaggregate at the regional or national level the well-being losses. And again, the ratio of the two is the socioeconomic resilience at the regional or at the country level. And I will show very briefly results on the Philippines. This is work done with Brian Walsh, working with me at the World Bank. This is one case, but we have about 12 countries now covered. And here what we have been doing is work at the regional level and go through this sequence. So the first image you see on the left here are the asset losses in the Philippines. And of course, it's mostly Manila, the capital of the country. So if the goal of your policy is to reduce disaster losses expressed in pesos, you would invest in Manila. The second map shows the impact on poverty. And here you see the image is very different. Manila is still there, but less than some of the eastern shore of the Philippines, because the poverty is much higher there. And the third map is this well-being impact, which using a welfare function is trying to balance those different groups in a way that take into account both what happens to rich and poor people. And what I wanted to flag is the last map, which is socioeconomic resilience. The redder the map, the least resilient the region is. And what you see is the south of the country, Mindanao, is the least resilient, but it doesn't have a lot of risk because there are very few typhoons there. So it's a place that is not affected very often, but when it is affected, damages will be very large because the population is really not equipped to cope. And the point we're making to the government in our discussions is you have to really explain what is the objective of your disaster reduction policy. Are you more concerned about the pure economics or about poverty or about something else? Because the indicator that you will be choosing to allocate funding, the very technical choice of this indicator will have a huge impact on where you spend and who benefits. Last point I want to make before concluding is that you can also look at those results per quintile. And you see here that asset losses are very much concentrated on the wealthiest quintile. The Philippines is a very unequal country, so a lot of assets are owned by the top 20%. But when you use a welfare function, the poorest really experience the largest welfare impacts. And what we can do with this work is to look at what transfers can do. So here we make an assumption that you tax the population proportionally, and you do cash transfer to all people affected by disasters. And you see that this benefits quite a lot the poorest, but also by comparing the welfare loss and gains, we can do a cost-benefit analysis of this type of policies, showing that here we have benefit-cost ratios around 4 or 5. So a lot of benefits which are mostly due to the distributional effects of transferring resources from the richest households to the poorest. And we did not do it in the Philippines, but you can also cut your household surveys in many ways. Here we work on Sri Lanka comparing the Sinhalese and the non-Sinhalese populations, so the ethnic majority versus the minority in the country. So you can also measure the resilience of those different groups to highlight things like here that the minority is much less resilient than the majority in the country. So again, another way of helping you think about the distributional and ethical consideration in your disaster risk management policy.
Stephane,
so I'll stop here. Yeah,
Stephane, I'm going to have to cut you off here because we do have a question and we have a comment. I want to leave time for that. Thank you very much.
I'm good. I'm done.
Paul, do you want to give a comment?
Stephane, that was outstanding. Very, very innovative and very important contribution. I want to encourage everybody to read the Global Risk Report. If you've not seen it, it came out in January. It's published each year by the World Economic Forum. A couple thousand leaders around the world are asked, what are the 30 risks? What's the likelihood that those risks will occur in the next 10 years across 30 different risks? And second, what would be the consequences if those global risks occurred? It's very interesting reading. And this year's report that came out in January, they looked at how the questions, the answers have changed over the years. As an economist, one of the things I noticed is some of the traditional economic issues were falling down in importance. Concern about inflation, a variety of issues are just less important than they used to be. But top of the list this year was the world leaders said the #1 issue for the next 10 years is going to be severe weather. This is the top global issue. It's found in most of the countries around the world, and that's our conversation today. One of the things that struck me about the Global Risk Report is that the items that were falling back in importance were the ones where we'd agreed how to measure them. We know how to measure inflation. We've had lots of debates over a long period of time, and there's a consistent approach that is carefully trying to get a real sense when inflation is bad and when it's not bad, and allows us to have a real consensus saying this isn't as big an issue as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. But the issues that are moving to the forefront, the reason why Stephane's presentation was so important, we haven't actually agreed on how to even measure the really important issues that are coming to the forefront. Stephane focused a little bit on the Philippines and talked about goats and other assets. Maybe those based in the United States might think this wasn't aimed at everyone. This is absolutely aimed at everyone. We really don't know how to measure how we are coping with wildfires in California and hurricanes in Florida and a number of different hazards. There has been a bias in the analysis being done, as Stephane led, by looking at assets that are destroyed by these terrible events. And that's a useful measure. That's something to start with. But it really isn't getting at the core questions. It's really not informing us to have a real conversation. So Stephane is using examples that may seem to some people far away, but they're absolutely relevant all around the world. If you would like to understand risks in the United States, we really are not yet properly measuring them. We're not getting into these sorts of questions. And those who have the time and can contribute to this conversation, there is a great opportunity to take on some of the emerging risks, like the point of this conference, and get into real basic questions like, how do we know how we're doing? Anyway, David, I'll turn it back to you. My quick comment was to not listen to Stephane's outstanding presentation and think about it only as something happening elsewhere in the world. This is relevant in the United States and elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to turn now to our final presenter, Tatyana Deryugina, who is an assistant professor of finance at the University of Illinois. Tatyana, you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be part of this session. This work is joined with my colleague, Ben Marks, and I should say that this is all quite preliminary and incomplete, so we're not ready for any of our numbers or findings to be officially cited. To give you some background on why the question that we're after is important, it's been known for quite a while that disaster damage is growing faster than GDP, and more generally, the concentration of people and of wealth in disaster-prone areas is increasing. Climate change is posed to increase the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, and indeed is doing that already. So addressing more frequent natural disasters is undoubtedly an important component of climate change adaptation, which is one reason why we're having this session today. Now, we could try to deal with natural disasters through formal insurance, but insurance uptake rates tend to be low, even in wealthy countries, and extreme events are systematic by their nature, so private insurance markets are unlikely to be adequate to fully protect people from such shocks, even in the wealthier nations. What else could help? Formal disaster aid from the government, which is in a better position to bear systematic shocks, as well as charitable donations from individuals who are outside of the who are living outside of the affected area. Both of these could be important complements to private insurance, but we don't yet fully understand their role in post-disaster recovery. So the question that we're going to be asking in this work is, what is the effect of media coverage on charitable giving and federal disaster aid in the aftermath of natural disasters? Anecdotally, both are thought to be important. Media coverage is thought to be important for both charitable giving and for disaster aid, but we have little rigorous empirical evidence on this question. Their main reason for this is that it's very difficult to be sure that you're isolating the effect of media coverage on charitable giving or federal disaster aid, as opposed to the effect of a disaster itself. More extreme disasters tend to attract more media coverage and more disaster aid and charitable giving. And so to really tease out the causal effect of media coverage, you need to adequately control for all the important disaster characteristics. And given the data that we have on natural disasters, it's just implausible to believe that we can do that credibly. So our approach is to instead focus on the occurrence of other newsworthy events as quasi-experimental variation in the attention or the media coverage of the natural disaster. And this is similar in spirit to Eisensee and Stromberg's 2007 QJE paper, where they look at the occurrence of events like the Olympics to understand the role of media coverage on international disaster aid. So to tell you a little bit more about why federal disaster aid and charitable donations are of particular interest is that if they are largely determined by need, then they represent a promising source of consumption smoothing for the future. In other words, in addition to having private insurance provide funds to victims, federal disaster aid and charitable donations can help fill the gaps that are left over by private insurance markets, which can't cover all possible losses. By contrast, if we find that federal disaster aid and charitable donations are determined by something else, like the media coverage that a disaster attracts, all else equal, then they're less great sources of consumption smoothing. But instead, such findings can help us understand why people give in the first place, so we can shed some light on the nature of altruism, and also understand the federal disaster aid process and how it can be improved. For example, if we find that media coverage is an important determinant of federal disaster aid, then that potentially warrants allowing for less discretion in the disaster aid process. More generally, the news media have been criticized for giving disproportionate amounts of coverage to some disasters over others. A recent example is Hurricanes Maria and Harvey that affected Puerto Rico and Houston, respectively. The media were criticized for giving Hurricane Maria less coverage, and the story went that it's partly because of who was affected by the hurricane in Puerto Rico versus in Houston. So while that is undesirable in itself, we also want to understand what are the consequences of receiving less media coverage. To answer this question, we're going to put together several data sets, all spanning the time period 1990 to 2017, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and from the Spatial Hazard Events Loss Database in the US. We're going to obtain the date of occurrence and the affected counties that experience tornadoes and floods. And in the future, we hope to add more natural disasters as well. The American Red Cross has generously shared with us data on daily donations with the donor zip code, so we know who is donating to the Red Cross and when. From FEMA, we obtain disaster level data on the federal, public, and individual assistance for a specific disaster. And our most novel data set is news coverage data from the Climate Center Global News Archive. This archive focuses on major national newspapers, such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, although it does include some Associated Press articles, which are often used by local newspapers. It does not include local newspapers themselves, although starting in 2006, it also contains some internet news feeds. So the way that we're gonna deal with this lack of local newspapers is to think about coverage of a disaster in a particular state. We don't have access to the full text of the database, but we can submit various queries to get a measure of both disaster coverage and other news. We're going to measure disaster coverage by querying the database with the name of the disaster, like tornado or flood, and some state names. So for example, we're going to query flood Alabama, flood Georgia, and so on, and use the resulting results as measures of the news coverage of a particular disaster on a particular date. Now, obviously, these are crude queries, but as I'll show you in a couple of slides, they provide a very good measure of news coverage of disasters. For other news, we're simply going to search for every different state. So we're going to have 50 queries for each disaster and then 50 queries for every state name to get a measure of general attention to a particular state on any given day or week, depending on how we aggregate the data. So before I show you how well our news coverage measure does, here's the response of charitable donations to an occurrence of, in this case, flood. So here the dependent variable is the total donations coming from state S on days T through T plus 27. So this is a 28-day measure of charitable donations as the dependent variable, and we take the inverse hyperbolic sign to reduce the influence of outliers. The independent variables here are the contemporaneous and 30 lags of flood fatalities in state S, also in inverse hyperbolic sign. So there are 31 variables in total. We control for state by month and month by year fixed effects. And what the results show basically is that people who are in the same state as the event donate much more to the American Red Cross than people who are in a state that's different from where the event occurred. So this is with respect to floods. We see a similar pattern when we look at tornado fatalities. So now instead of having flood fatalities on the right-hand side, we have tornado fatalities. So donations to the American Red Cross respond strongly and persistently in the aftermath of these events, which is not surprising, but it just gives us a sign that our identification strategy of looking at variations within the US across states is going to be promising and give us something meaningful. Here's a more important graph. Here, we're regressing flood news coverage in state S on days T through T plus 27. So a 4-week measure of news coverage on the contemporaneous and 30 lags of flood fatalities in state S. So if our queries for flood plus state were just complete noise, we wouldn't see anything significant here. Instead, what we see is that when there's a flood fatality, our index of flood media coverage increases substantially and persistently. And we see a similar pattern for tornadoes. The tornado news coverage appears to die off more quickly. We're agnostic as to why that is. Flood fatalities are different from tornado fatalities. Floods tend to be more autocorrelated across time. Nonetheless, with both floods and tornadoes, we see a persistent increase in coverage after that event. So now let's move on to our key results. Here, we're regressing weekly charitable donations coming from state S on our measure of other newsworthy events. So the way that we measure other newsworthy events is we take all the news that are matching a particular state's query. We take out all the news that we've identified as being related to floods or tornadoes, because we don't want to put tornado news on the right-hand side. So we're only left with non-disaster events. And then we count up what % of the total content is made up by stories that are in the top 10% by content length. So if all stories were equally important, the top 10% of stories would always account for 10% of the content. In practice, on any given week, there are more and less important stories. So the top 10% of stories always account for more than top 10% of content. And in some weeks, they account for more than half the content, for an example. And that's what we think about as weeks when something important is going on, although at this point, we're agnostic as to exactly what that is. And so what you see here is when we regress the total amount of donations to the American Red Cross on the share of the news that was devoted to the top 10% of events interacted with whether there was a disaster in that week, we see persistent reductions in weekly charitable donations. So if we scale the coefficients, we conclude that a 1 standard deviation increase in the share top 10 during a week when there's a tornado or flood reduces charitable donations by about 6.5%. And last week's important news stories also matter, with a coefficient that's about 2/3 of the size. So following other newsworthy stories, there's about a 10% reduction in charitable giving. When we look at federal aid, however, we don't see any significant coefficients, except for maybe one that's marginally significant. Some of the estimates are a bit noisier, so we're still working with this result, but preliminary results indicate that there's no evidence that federal disaster aid responds to the occurrence of other newsworthy events. So those are obviously other newsworthy events. How do these relate to how much coverage the natural disaster itself gets? Here we show that when other newsworthy events occur, there's a lower share of news that's devoted to media coverage of natural disaster. So that's one potential mechanism through which the occurrence of other newsworthy events reduces charitable donations. So to summarize, we show that US flood and tornado fatalities lead to large increases in media coverage devoted to these events and donations to the American Red Cross from donors in the affected states. This is not particularly surprising, but useful to document and quantify. More importantly, what we then go on to show is that the occurrence of other newsworthy events right before or during the week of the natural disaster reduces this charitable response, but it does not significantly affect federal disaster aid. We think that the most likely mechanism is the crowd out of media coverage of the natural disaster itself. However, this is not the only possible mechanism. For example, other newsworthy events might just distract potential donors from the natural disaster. So even without crowd out, something like a political event occurring might distract potential donors from thinking about the natural disaster, all else equal. In future work, we hope to shed light on these and other possibilities. This Climate Center database also has a measure of sentiment of the news, so we can see if it's just the total amount of other newsworthy events that matters, or if certain types of events as measured by their sentiments matter more than others. And I look forward to hopefully reporting the results of those exercises in the future.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Tatyana, and we look forward to hearing from you again next year, maybe. Some comments from Paul Kovacs, please.
Tatyana, thank you. Very, very clever analysis, and excellent. You were able to get the cooperation of the Red Cross to share that very unique data to allow us to share those insights with us. I'm going to share one story, but where my story is leading to is that your research and the story I'm going to share troubles me about the apparent disconnection between charitable giving, perhaps government response, and need. And given the scarce resources around, I think putting more of a spotlight on that is a really important part of how I'm understanding your research, that if there's a disconnection back to need, that means there's an opportunity to do better. Anyway, if I can share my story, but I'll do it quickly. So 5 years ago in 2016, there was a wildfire in northern Alberta in Canada. To this day, it's still the most costly event ever to occur in Canada. We had the largest community in the northern part of Canada evacuated for a month. At the time, in 2015, it was the most expensive wildfire in the world. That's since been passed by a number of California events, but at that time, it was terrible. It was a really, really awful event, and led to a lot of national news coverage about the awful experience. There was also an outpouring of giving. The Canadian Red Cross, in its previous 100 years, had not collected as much money as it did after that one event. It was a lot of people really trying to help. But there was a real challenge for the Red Cross to figure out how to best bring things forward. With wildfires, certainly in Canada, but my understanding in most of the United States, if you have a house and you have a mortgage, then you have insurance, which includes fires. So everybody in Canada that was affected by a wildfire, the insurance gave them back their house. We had a lot of homes burned to the ground and they got a new home. We had people that were out of their home for a month and all their food went bad, and so they got a new refrigerator and food to put in it. They had smoke damage to their... Anyway, they got money from private insurance to cover almost all the costs, and the Red Cross had a great deal of funds available to help, but they were really struggling. What could they do with those funds? And they were incredibly creative. They invented lots of things that they'd never done before in Canada. They've promoted, when the US is called Fire Smart, but in Canada, Fire Wise, but in Canada it's called Fire Smart. So this was trying to anticipate future fires and encourage people to better landscape. And there was a lot of very, very creative ways the Red Cross sought to use the money to make people more resilient going forward. But of all the hazards in Canada, we've had terrible floods where people were in real need, and the giving was not in place to offer the kind of help that was available here. Of the two examples that you touched on here, Tatyana, after a flood, there are an awful lot of people in the United States who really need help, and most are not buying the flood insurance program. Where assistance come from is unclear. It's my understanding on tornado that tornado is included. If you have insurance, you have wind coverage, tornado coverage anyway. And I would think that there is a lot of need, but it's very different after a tornado than it is after a flood. And so to the extent that your learning is showing that giving is influenced by the media coverage of an event and how terrible the event is, but not necessarily tied back to the actual need, I think that is a really important finding. And I look forward to learning more from that. It certainly was my one example I gave here in Canada, but you doing it at a much more systematic level is a really big contribution to the conversation. So that's my comment. Thank you, Tatyana, for sharing that. And David, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, we've had three fantastic and interesting presentations. I'd like to thank you for joining this session and invite you to our next sessions at 11 a.m. Listed here in the slides, 4 sessions. Remember that our sessions will be recorded, so you can choose one, but they'll all be available to you in the recordings that will be sent out after the conference. So again, thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to the rest of the day.